This is the Open Source Entrepreneur Network podcast with me, your host, John Mark Walker. Today's guest is Shane Coughlan. Shane is the manager and founder of the Openchain project. Openchain deals with a subject near and dear to my heart, and that is supply chain management, especially in an open source context. So Shane will be talking about that today. Shane also manages and runs a blog called The Faces of Open Source Law, which I'll include a link to in the YouTube comments. Without further ado, here's Shane Coughlan. So yes, it's a pleasure to have you here. You run the Openchain project, and I got to say, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I think it's right up the alley of the readership and listening audience for OSEN, and I'd really like to learn more about it. Tell us, a bit about yourself and how Openchain came about.
Okay, so with regards to me, I have one of the least remarkable profiles and least interesting stories you'll probably have had on this podcast. But the short version is,
try me.
And the British Isles, we always start off small, and then we hope that something we say sounds more impressive. And I came into this field over a decade ago, and I'm Irish. I've been educated in the UK, and I ended up accidentally running Free Software Foundation Europe's legal department in Switzerland. That was an auspicious start to my career in open source. I was on a German NGO salary living in Zurich, something I recommend to everyone who wants to practice economics.
Excellent.
But it was a fantastic opportunity. Free Software Foundation Europe was starting its legal department. They needed someone to head it up, and that's where I came in. I'm a political scientist rather than a lawyer, so my job was to cat herd lawyers, both internal and external, and try to get high quality singular approaches to open source law across the European space via this nonprofit organization.
Great.
After a few years doing that and setting up some networks, I began to work in the patent space around open source, and then I swung back again more recently to come to the copyright space, where now, as you mentioned, I head up Openchain, which is the initiative to deal with open source software license compliance in the supply chain. So you could say that all of my career in open source has been dealing with governance, either on copyright or patents. And my sole focus at the moment is on the copyright side. Openchain is an initiative to ensure that we all have the same general approaches and the same level of quality in how we address open source in the global supply chain. And the basic idea here is, from the biggest to the smallest company, you can have access to the overarching processes and access to the knowledge about best practices that allow you to deal with open source with as few hitches as possible. Openchain is a foundation project, so we're tied in with a lot of other really cool stuff.
That's great. When did it start being a Linux Foundation project?
Openchain started as a kernel of an idea about 3 years ago at a meeting of the Legal Network. The Legal Network is the vaguely named, very large network run by Free Software Foundation Europe for lawyers to share knowledge. Tires were kicked, checklists were made, ideas were booted around, and it took about 2 years before it became a real project underway. It was launched as a Linux Foundation project last October. We went live with the first version of the spec.
That's wonderful. So, okay, so let's dive in. When you say global supply chain, let's talk about terminology we're using here, because I want everyone to understand what we're talking about. When you say global supply chain, we're talking about supply chain, open source. What are you talking about?
So when I say the supply chain, I mean every company involved in shipping any software. It may be on physical products or it may not. So in practice, an awful lot of this stuff boils down to embedded IoT, automotive, places like that, where people are shipping a physical product that may or indeed usually does contain open source. And the big challenge here is that, of course, we're not really talking about one supply chain that's beautifully integrated. We're talking about hundreds of different supply chains into multiple market sectors, and everyone
Yes.
is touched by open source. Yeah, and our slight hiccup in this is that because it's so many different things at the same time, so many different players of different sizes, the idea of having one quality standard for this, let's call it the ISO 9001 of open source compliance quality, is something that we hadn't got to yet in our community. It's a maturity point where we hadn't got to, and Openchain is it. It's where we've started to build it out.
Yeah, because when you look at the provenance of some of the open source components that go into, a lot of code these days, it can be somewhat difficult to ascertain. I just ran a meetup last night where somebody from Black Duck was presenting, and they were saying that in their latest survey from 2016 for code for software written in 2016, 96% of it contains embedded open source parts. The software may be proprietary, but the extensive use of open source is now so pervasive that we're now getting into this area where, using open source is great, but there's a whole lot there that it frankly scares me how little people think about provenance and maintenance and keeping it up to date, and what you were just saying about treating it as a supply chain.
Well, I was reminded there of something that Mark Radcliffe from DLA Piper said not that long ago. He said the only company he'd encountered which didn't use open source had a CEO and two other staff members, one to his left and one to his right.
Mhm.
The three of them coding together, they actually didn't use open source. We're very, very much in a world where software is open source and it's everywhere. And a few years ago, I recall when I was working in OIN, Fujitsu General, one of Fujitsu group companies, joined the OIN community. And I was curious because I checked their website and so on, and they made air conditioners, and it turned out that
Sorry, just for the sake of the listeners, OIN, Open Invention Network, is that what you mean?
Yep, that's Open Invention Network,
Okay.
the patent non-aggression community around open source. And basically, OIN asks everyone to say that they're not going to use their patents around what's called the Linux system, core
Right.
group source components. And Fujitsu General joined, and I was curious because as far as I could tell, they mostly made air conditioners. And indeed, your air conditioner runs Linux nowadays. It's pervasive. It is the software that's used everywhere. And that's where something like Openchain comes in, because we're providing that high-level quality assurance, this kind of, as I said, the ISO 9001, of saying that, okay, so do you have some processes for inbound software? Do you have, for instance, an open source policy? Do you have some processes for outbound open source software? Nothing too complex, just the general overarching structure of processes. And that's important, because the idea here isn't to dictate the precise best practices, but to get people thinking about, do I have these processes in place? Do I have an open source contact? Do I have an open source policy? And quite often there might be one or two little pieces missing that Openchain helps them think through, and they can choose their own best practice to fit that particular missing part of the sequence. And in doing so, we end up with providing the same basic level of quality for every company in the global supply chain of any size.
Okay. That's interesting. It's an interesting way, a lens to kind of look at, how software is delivered, managed, etc. I can remember the first time that I started to think of it in these terms when I have a friend who works in Intel's supply chain group. And one day we're having coffee, and he looked at me and he said, "I got it. I finally understand what it is that you do." And at the time I was a community manager guy at a startup before we were acquired by Red Hat. And he was saying that, at Intel, we have, we source different components from various places, and then we have a supply chain funnel, and everything goes through the funnel. And so we source the components, we kind of lay it out, we piece them together, and as it goes through the funnel, it gets closer and closer to what they call product ready, or production ready, when it's finally ready to ship as an actual product. So on the left-hand side of the funnel, it's raw pieces, and on the right-hand side, it's a finished product where all those components are embedded, and you can't even tell them. You can't even tell where one component ends and another begins. And he said, now that you've described to me what you do, I get it. You're the guy who pieces together the raw software parts on the left-hand side of the funnel. And I thought for a second, and it was one of those moments I'll never forget, because I had never considered it in that respect. And I thought, you're right. It is a supply chain funnel, and software is frankly no different in that regard. And you have all these open source pieces, and over time they congeal. If you know what you're doing to create this it's never an end result, because software is always changing, as we know. But it was one of those kind of career altering moments where I realized that I was thinking about this stuff all wrong. I'm curious, when you come across people and you describe what you do and what Openchain is, do you get blank stares? What's kind of the overall reception to your message, and whenever you encounter new people and that sort of thing?
Well, this is summed up in one simple story. It's that about once a year, my wife asks me, "So, what is it you do again?" I'm not sure.
I get that question a lot. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not actually sure that we ever finish this conversation. But yeah, both of us fit into that nebulous world of where we're definitely doing something, and I think that for me it has boiled down to I'm a cog in a very large machine which helps with the governance of open source. Whether it was on the copyright side in the early days, or the patent side in the midpoint, or now I'm back in copyright, it's always been about how do we govern this stuff, this party products of software, these third-party components. What's the type of governance model? And Openchain is the mature version of that. It's where we got to after many years.
Right.
Let me give you a story. And this is
yes.
Yeah. This is a true story about what not to do.
I love this story.
Yeah, this is when we first had the idea of Openchain, we all kind of said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we all got together and managed the global supply chain, because then it would get better. And everyone said, yeah, that would be really cool. So how do we do that? And a checklist was created, and it was like 144 questions long. And this was essentially people who've been doing this for ages, and it was multinational lawyers who are used to working with big processes. Just like, for instance, when you're in a company like Red Hat, you've got scope for big processes.
Right.
And this checklist would have worked as long as you were a big company. But we looked at the checklist,
and you had someone who called themselves a software asset manager.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you got this huge checklist. It's a stack of paperwork, and then you think about the documentation you have around it, and it would turn into a telephone book. And you think, this is complete. This is pristine. This covers all the bases we can think of. And we looked at that and we thought, okay, so let's throw that one away. Because as nice as that was, it was theoretical. And most of the supply chain, it's companies which have very little personnel and resources to put on this stuff.
Right.
And we had to think, so how do we flip this on its head? How do we start as simple as possible and make that onboarding to the quality level that, let's say, a Red Hat or an IBM can do? Start somewhere small. And the story of Openchain is the story of how we started to think through that seriously. And we were inspired by ISO 9001, which basically allows you to have the general framework. And inside that framework, your specific best practices, that's up to you. And quite literally, one thing we have is the question, do you have an open source policy? And the answer could be, our policy is we do not use any open source. Now, that's probably a silly policy, because you'd be wasting efficiency, and it's not a realistic policy because your engineers are probably going to use open source. but it's an example of a policy. And
Right.
from this sense, we created Openchain from the perspective of how do we make this as simple as possible? And what's interesting for me, and we're going right back to my wife's story here, is that when I sat down and said, this is about quality control and open source, and we're trying to get everyone to agree on the same level of quality, she said, oh, now I get it. And for the first time,
Interesting.
marital bliss was achieved. We had clarity. What is he doing in front of the computer all day? Quality control of some sort.
Well, it helps to break it down to the simplest possible terms, which I guess is the moral of that story. Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. So one of the problems, if you look at, say, GitHub, and you look at how a lot of software is made today, and you talk about governance, and I have to tell you that I did come across one of those software people with the title software asset management person, and they hate open source compliance, hate it, because to them it just adds another extra layer of complexity to a job that's already pretty complex. And they're so when I tell them, oh, your engineering team should use more open source because they can be more efficient, and he goes, it doesn't make me more efficient. It makes me less efficient because I'm the guy who has to deal with this. So I'm curious if you come across the kind of resistance, especially corporate resistance, just because it adds an extra layer of compliance that they don't have to deal with.
On this kind of knee jerk, we do get the thing of, oh God, are you going to make us do another layer of stuff?
Right.
And that's probably where we quickly counter. Actually, we're here to reduce the layers. And Openchain's meant to be able to make it a lot simpler to do what you have to do anyway to deliver, essentially. And here I jump into phraseology, which is
right
corporate speak, but to deliver third-party IP effectively, you're going to need some processes in place. You can't just check out third-party IP.
And I guess the ultimate goal is that you should be able to streamline it as part of your regular ongoing, processes. And so that honestly, it kind of confused me, because I thought, it shouldn't be that much different from any other type. Although I guess you have to think about the differences in, say, GPL versus Apache, that sort of thing. But, it shouldn't be that much different from the usual landmines you come across when it comes to incorporating, third-party stuff.
No, absolutely. And open source software is no different from any other software when you come down to a governance level. It's just stuff.
Right.
And like Openchain is designed to be a way to manage that stuff as simply as possible. And because Openchain is really high level, looking at the big question, do you have a process in place to identify this incoming into your company? It doesn't say what process. It just asks, do you have a process?
Right.
That means an awful lot of companies are already at the cusp or qualify for Openchain conformance. It's really about that big picture. Do you have these things in place? And occasionally you get something where someone doesn't have something in place. And I'll give you a quick example.
Right.
We asked, do you train your engineers, a certain amount of engineers, 80, 85%, do you train them every 24 months? On this topic? And if your answer is no, we haven't actually talked to them for the last half decade, that's where we, it's one of those things where we can say, well, you probably should tell them a bit more. And we provide reference decks where you can build out your open source training if it's not already existent.
Nice.
Yeah, the reference.
It's one of the...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, the reference deck is not the example of the core of Openchain spec. It's the example of the ancillary material around it. So that if people have a question point where they're like, well, I don't have that. What is that? Or how do I do it better? How do I do it in the same level as, let's say, a Red Hat, an ARM, a Qualcomm? Well, we can say, well, here's a reference training deck. This training deck is made from material from Qualcomm, from Samsung, from ARM. And it's CC0. You can just take it and play.
That's great. One of the things I've noticed is that with GitHub and the developers and the way software is made, developers just don't want to care about governance, provenance, they can barely be bothered to put a license file in their repository.
Yeah.
What do you say to those people?
Well, I was one of them.
Okay, I appreciate your candor.
Well, I mean, let's give your listeners something meaty. The way I got into governance was that I got myself threatened with a lawsuit. When I was way back when, I was doing GPL code, and I was doing a GPL and MPL code, and I was doing a spin on Mozilla Thunderbird with some GNU PG stuff incorporated in it. And this was one of those put it on a USB stick and off you go. And someone pointed out to me that they didn't think I was adhering to the GPL component license correctly.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Those are words everyone loves to hear.
Yeah, yeah. And well, I was something like 24, so I was really worried. I had no idea how that worked. I thought I'd done what I had to.
Right.
And I was terrified I'd be sued. And basically, I had a very productive and useful conversation with the FSF, who guided me through what I needed to do it properly. And I think the moral of my story is that being 24 means that you can be quite young and stupid. But it also indicates that I was interested in making code and putting code out there, and I didn't want to put time on the license. And that's totally understandable. It's completely understandable. But when you move into the business space, or when your software might move into the business space, the fact is that you've got people at play who are dealing with reputations and money, where it really matters to get this stuff right. And I was a developer scratching an itch. And honestly, it didn't matter that much that I'd messed up per se, but it did matter to me that I was inadvertently making my software more difficult to use properly, and that I wasn't respecting the original developer's rights properly. And I had to face that, and I was fortunate to do it. And I think that's kind of a story that underlines to me the importance of license compliance.
Sure.
If you want users to be cool, if you want the upstream to be cool, the license is the shared rule. And you don't want to have to spend time on licensing, but it's the way that you play fair. And it's the way that, because of that, you get access to this code. And if you're not listening to the license, if you're not following it, well, ultimately you're undermining your ability to have access to these channels of code in the future. And that's just not a good idea. It's
self-defeating. At what point should developers start to care about this stuff? Should it be after they form a company? Is it too late by then? Should they have already started this process before that point?
I think it's best to start early. It's best to do it at the very beginning, because that's when you'll have the least amount of difficulty and time to put into it to get it right. So, start off and just say, what is my license? What is the code I'm using based on? And it should take a few minutes if you're just starting a project to get that done. But if you go all the way through,
if you go all the way through.
If you go all the way through developing a project and bringing in different pieces of code to solve problems, you'll come back at a spaghetti mess and think, oh boy.
Yes, and in fact, I've seen projects come to that point on more than one occasion. It's tough to sell. I mean, I guess at this point we're still at the stage where just getting people to think about it is a win, because it means we've progressed. But at what point is that no longer good? I mean, how are we going to get to some sort of established best practice? And I know that's kind of, or it seems to be, I would think your end game to get people beyond just thinking about it, which is great. But how do we get people to accept some sort of best practice? In fact, maybe even put some kind of certification meat behind it.
Well, here's where I think that we're on the cusp of something really important.
Okay.
Openchain is probably the solution that will do this, and it will probably do it in a lot shorter order than we expected, simply because the market is primed and ready for this. And by the market, I mean the commercial and non-commercial space of using open source software. Our big problem now is that we all use open source. We know it's vital, and we're placing it in an unbelievable amount of different types of projects and products. And without one coherent standard for how we approach that, we all get these mismatches, these conflicts around, is this correct, is this not? Do we trust this, do we not? And whenever we have those questions, we're reducing the core efficiency of open source.
Right.
Right. And this is where we're all becoming cognizant of that fact. We're all beginning to realize, hey, actually, the real value of open source isn't code. It's hard to make code. We put a lot of time in building code.
Right.
Open source isn't really code, it's collaboration.
Exactly.
Right. And the fundamental thing that makes this collaboration work is that we trust each other. And I'll put a slight quotation mark on trust here, because you've never met this person. You don't know.
I've never met you, and yet I'm trusting what you say right now.
Right. And that's the cool thing about our community. It's like, well, John Walker's got me on his podcast, and that's awesome. And there's a question you could say, who's John Walker? He's a guy. But we trust each other because we know we're in this community. We know where we're at. And on the software side, the trust is the license. And that's where, things like Openchain are solving the question of how do we make sure that on the context of licenses, there's trust between entities, individuals, companies. It doesn't really matter. How do we create that trust on the license front so that we all know everyone's playing fair? And that's been something we've been waiting for years, and it's finally here. And that's where I think in the next few months, you're going to see Openchain start to really get legs under it. We're getting all kinds of signups. We're getting small companies joining Openchain and saying we're Openchain conformant.
Sure.
Multinationals. And that just indicates one simple thing. People want trust between entities in the international software community. And that's what Openchain provides in the context of open source.
Fantastic. So just to give you a bit of a plug, I saw today where you posted Ibrahim Haddad from Samsung had donated a couple of had donated some compliance materials. Is there anything else you want to plug, including your website, just so people know where to go to find out more?
Right. So we're at www.openchainproject.org, and that's where you can find all the basic information about Openchain. The website and the intent of Openchain in these early days is to build trust between commercial entities. But we're already seeing Openchain get legs beyond that. We're seeing posts from people like Jonas Oberg, the executive director of Free Software Found Europe, talking about Openchain for projects. And there's really no limit to the amount of information you can find around Openchain and the type of organizations you can apply it to. So have a look at the website. Think of it as a way, an overarching ISO 9001 to build trust between entities in the supply chain. And while you're there, pick up some of the training materials. Look under the curriculum part of the website, and you'll notice that there's slide deck and other materials that are under CC0. They can be used for training. They can be used for building out best practices. And they're as applicable to projects as they are to companies. Also, if you want to talk with me, Coughlan, that's Coughlan, at linux.com, available for any purpose, really, around open source licensing, governance, and compliance. Happy to talk with everyone for every reason. I'm lucky because my job description is like, do it all.
Well, this is a fascinating subject. Thank you so much for an enlightening half hour. I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you for coming by.
Thank you very much.